Okay, so problem sets are due today by the end of class. Gavin's going to come and pick them up. The schedule for the rest of the semester is actually a little bit strange just because of like pre-planned things and some unexpected events. So Friday, actually, we will not have lecture this coming Friday, basically because my grandfather passed away last week, and so I have to like go to a memorial service this Friday. So that is not going to happen. But we should still get through all the materials. I don't think it's going to be a huge deal. Then Monday, I forget if I announced this a while ago, but we'll have a guest lecture by Max Offhammer from my department. And what he wants to talk about is up to him, but I suspect it'll be climate change related. But I'll have to check with Max. I'll send an email out. Wednesday, as I announced, like we will not have class from 3 to 4 p.m. on Wednesday before Thanksgiving. Historically, that has not led to any significant attendance. So we'll just that won't happen. And then we have one more week after that. So we're going to have, I guess, 3 lectures after this one, which will I think actually turn out to be just about right in terms of material. So today we're going to finish up the cost effectiveness stuff that I was talking about on Monday. And then the last sort of set of topics I want to talk about are basically market failures in healthcare or in sort of the health economics genre. And that's going to consist of both some sort of slides and discussion that I've already posted. It's like a lecture 15 slides, and we might start by the end of today. And then we're also going to do another sort of game/activity, which will probably take at least 1 lecture. And it's going to be it's basically going to demonstrate the problems with health insurance markets, in particular adverse selection issues. So that'll happen basically probably like a Wednesday or something after Thanksgiving. Certainly sometime during that last week of classes. It would probably be in your self-interest to attend then because like your group will get performance based. So sort of like the public goods game where you guys like the groups score different numbers of points. Again, you'll be able to sort of score more or less points depending on how well your group does. And so that's going to be those 2 things will basically be the last week of lectures we have after Thanksgiving. And then of course we're going to hit the reading week or whatever. And probably I think we have like 3 lecture or 3 class times technically that we attendance during that week is optional. And there's 3 slots that we could use. I don't think we'll use all 3, but I'll use at least 1 or 2 to do sort of like review stuff. I'll give you some old final exams and stuff that you can study from. In terms of problem sets, those will be 1 more problem set, which we'll be due probably around then. But I'll post that before Thanksgiving as well. That's just going to basically go over some stuff that we're going over right now and we've gone over a little bit in the past. Okay, so when we left off on Monday, we were talking about like the benefits of angioplasty as sort of a case study, and so one of the points that I made, I think was just on the last slide, is that so ironically, because angioplasty is a relatively non-invasive procedure, that you don't actually have to cut somebody open, you just have to put a small hole in them and insert a catheter, and because it's not that invasive, you can actually do it in a lot of cases. So that can lead to substantial overuse in the sense that it may be used in cases in which it's not very cost-effective, like these sort of like preemptive cases where you're identifying people that you think might have a heart attack at some point, and so you're going to insert a stent into them to try to head that off. And maybe once in a while it does head something off, but like 99.9% of the time you're preventing something that wouldn't have happened anyway. So if you contrast that to some extremely invasive procedures like this carotid endarterectomy, where they're actually like cutting somebody's carotid artery open and scraping plaque off of the inside, and it's not uncommon for people to die in surgery when that's occurring because it's so dangerous, that type of procedure isn't really prone to overuse in the sense that any sort of professional ethics at all will dictate that you won't use that unless it's like a really serious situation where you really think it's going to help. Because if it's just kind of this marginal case of, well, maybe they'll have a stroke at some point, but we're not really sure, that's not going to be sufficient reason to slice open somebody's carotid artery. So in those types of procedures, what you have here, so this is the marginal benefit, and you're going marginal benefit plotted against like how many procedures or total number of times you're doing the procedure. And so the marginal benefit of a very invasive procedure can fall quickly down to below 0 because of the risks involved, whereas the marginal benefit of the less invasive procedure can kind of be very low, but not necessarily 0 because there's much less risk. And so because of that, you can get a whole lot more of the procedures done. And so if we look at basically the marginal benefit versus the marginal cost of the less invasive procedure here, so this is like looking at inserting stents via angioplasty. So if S prime of X is basically, S of X is like your health outcome, so higher is better here. S prime of X then is the marginal increase in health as you do more of these procedures, which is the variable X. And so when you sort of plot it against the number of patients, you see that initially there's some patients for whom inserting the stent is highly cost effective. So those are the patients who just had a heart attack, are in the hospital right now, they had a heart attack 1 hour ago, you do the imaging, you figure out that in fact there is like a problem in that particular artery, and you go in and you insert the stent. So for those people, it's been clinically proven that the procedure is actually effective in terms of increasing their survival odds. But then there aren't that many of those people, and so then you get into these cases where you're doing it like a week after the heart attack, which the clinical research that we discussed showed wasn't particularly effective, and then you get into these cases where they haven't even had a heart attack yet, and you're still doing it anyway. So the marginal benefit falls off, and at some point, not too far, like not after doing not that many procedures, it falls below the cost per angioplasty, which is that blue line. And so once it falls below the cost, of course, you don't actually want to be doing these procedures because the marginal cost of doing it exceeds the benefit. But that's not really how, like from a clinical perspective, that's not really how doctors make their decisions. They're really more thinking about like, is there any potential medical benefit at all to this procedure? And so that's looking, basically you're going to do it up until the point at which the actual benefit or the expected benefit falls below 0. So you can end up with sort of this entire range of, or this entire set of patients who are getting a procedure, but for whom the benefits are substantially less than the cost. So that's basically everybody from here out to this point. And so just filling that in, and you can see it's the shaded area. Ideally, from a cost-benefit perspective, you'd like to stop at that point, but you keep on going well past that point. And the other thing that's sort of interesting then is that small differences in beliefs about the effectiveness of the procedure can then have pretty large cost implications. So let's suppose that essentially doctors think that instead of the red line representing the marginal benefit of doing the procedure, instead this dashed blue line represents the marginal benefit of doing the procedure. So you've only shifted it up by a very small amount. But because of the fact that it's basically so slowly, or so the slope is so shallow out here, shifting it up by just a very small amount actually substantially like pushes out the point at which the marginal benefit curve is going to fall below the 0 axis. And so because of that, you're going to continue doing them all the way out until you do Z of them rather than X, which is how many you were doing before. So you have all of this additional cost here with almost no benefit occurring. So just to sort of reiterate or look at this on I guess a more aggregated scale rather than just a single procedure. So if you look at differences in expenditures, especially this is expenditures near end of life. So that we've already talked about how expenditure levels per patient or per Medicare enrollee can vary substantially across different regions of the country, despite the fact there doesn't seem to be much difference in outcomes. And so what's being plotted here is that basically what you're seeing here are costs per enrollee or cost per patient by quintile. So this is basically like the first quintile is basically the cheapest area where you have the lowest cost, and then the fifth quintile is the most expensive area where you have the highest cost, and then of course the intermediate quintiles are sort of intermediate cost areas. But not only are we plotting here the overall costs in terms of spending near the end of life, but we're also breaking it down into which types of procedures are actually, or which types of costs are actually generating the aggregate cost. So the dark blue is basically major procedures or spending on major procedures. The light yellow is spending on minor procedures. Red is imaging, so that's basically diagnostic stuff, but it would be like specific imaging, things like X-rays and MRIs and CAT scans and so forth. Green are other diagnostic tests, so that would be probably more things like blood tests and so forth. And then this light blue is evaluation and management. So that's going to involve a lot of doctor's visits, basically, and in particular probably involves many more specialist visits as you get up to the fifth quintile as opposed to looking at the first quintile. So if you look at where these differences between the different quintiles, the different spending quintiles are coming from, you can see that actually major procedures are not the main source, right? So this is what these numbers are the ratio for each of the categories between the fifth quintile and the first quintile. And so for major procedures, actually the most expensive quintile, they're only spending 5% more on major procedures than the least expensive quintile. So the major procedures aren't actually driving most of these increased costs. And that's kind of consistent with what we were talking about just a few slides ago, in the sense that the major procedures often involve like substantial risks. And so these aren't the types of things that really lend themselves to overuse, because you're only going to use them in very serious cases in which probably like most physicians would use them. But you're not going to sort of use them in these marginal cases because they're going to entail substantial clinical risks. Minor procedures, though, can potentially be much more elastic. So those are the, this is like, just like the angioplasty isn't all that invasive. These are procedures that might not have like a big or a large marginal benefit in those cases in which you're using them in these high spending areas, but they don't really impose any significant clinical risks as well. And so you're sort of much more flexible in increasing the number of procedures you're doing along that margin. So there you see that minor procedures are about 45% higher, spending on minor procedures is about 45% higher in the highest quintile versus the lowest one. And then for imaging, diagnostic tests, and then evaluation and management, you can see that they're all about 60 to 70 or even 80% higher. So those are basically like zero risk procedures, right? There's no risk in getting imaging except insofar as if it's like a CAT scan or something, there's some radiation risk, but that's not something that you would ever be able to attribute directly. I mean, if you got cancer from that, you would never know. So it's, for the most part, imaging doesn't really involve any risk. Diagnostic tests also don't involve any risk, and then just going and getting evaluated and getting more opinions doesn't involve any risk. So these are things that, clinically speaking, don't have substantial costs in the sense that there isn't additional risk to doing them, but of course, from an actual dollar perspective or from an economic resource perspective, there are substantial costs. And so it's perhaps not surprising that these are kind of the margins that are the most elastic in terms of observing higher levels of spending on these things in high spending areas. So one example of how you can, or how it can easily you can easily end up spending a lot more on imaging is this advertisement that's actually taken from I think a urology journal, which is basically making a numerical or a revenue-based argument to urologists that they should increase the number of imaging scans that they're doing. So what the product that's being advertised here is basically a CT imaging machine for urologists. So it's going to go in and take X-rays or computed tomography, which is basically just a much fancier type of X-ray, and attempt to diagnose presumably prostate problems. And so what the company that's advertising this machine is doing is laying out for physicians exactly how much money they might or might not make if they use, or if they purchase one of these machines for their practice and then use it. And so as you might imagine, this is basically a big capital expense, right? So you're going to go in, you're going to purchase this CT imaging machine, and that's a fixed cost, and it's going to be amortized over the total number of actual CT scans that you do, right? So if you do a lot of CT scans, then that's going to bring the cost down, and it's going to make it much more cost effective from the perspective of the physician. If you do only a few, then it's going to be hard to basically break even on your capital expenditure. And so they show these different potential, or basically the potential return depending on how many scans you're doing. So in like row A, they're assuming you're only doing 1.8 procedures per day, which works out to 20 procedures per month. And I guess the average payment for each patient that you run the scan on is going to be $220, so you make about $8,000. The return on investment they're saying per month turns out to be break even, so the return on investment over 5 years is break even. So there's a case where in theory you should be like just about indifferent between buying a machine and not buying it. But as you increase the number of procedures you're doing per day, the return on investment is going to increase. So at 5 procedures per day in row B, you end up making a profit of like $843,000 over the 5-year period that you're looking at owning and operating a machine. And then if you go up to 10 procedures per day, then you're making $2.1 million or $2.2 million of profit over the 5-year period that you're owning and operating a machine. So obviously, this creates a huge sort of incentive problem in the sense that once you buy the machine, then you have to make up the money, and the way to make up the money is to run more scans. And so once you find yourself in that situation, then of course, whenever you're even remotely indifferent between recommending that the patient get a scan and not recommending it, you're going to recommend that they get the scan because you need to make up this fixed cost that you purchased. So that of course creates huge incentive problems, or basically moral hazard problems, and that's something that we'll talk about more when we're talking about the market failures in healthcare. But again, it's in part the reason that that it's easy to find yourself in a situation where you are doing all these scans because the risk from each scan is pretty minimal. So this isn't something that has any sort of naturally limiting, or there's no additional clinical risk that would sort of naturally limit how many scans you might be inclined to do. So in aggregate, when you're thinking about healthcare costs, then you want to think about there's 3 different categories of treatments here. So in the case of cardiovascular, treating cardiovascular disease, we talked about the first clinical studies just showing that super simple stuff like aspirin and other drugs here can basically have large clinical impacts on reducing the risk of a heart attack, and the costs of these things are basically close to zero. So the circle is basically showing you the size of benefits and costs. And so for those first category 1 treatments, you have they're extremely cost effective. You get a lot of improved health for a really low cost. Now, ironically, it's not always the case that people get prescribed these category 1 treatments in all areas or in all practices. So you would think that given that they're effective and cost nothing, that would anywhere you go they would say this is what you should be getting. But even just looking within the U.S., you can find places in which they're not necessarily always prescribing these category 1 treatments, even though they're clearly cost effective. Then you get to these category 2 treatments, which are somewhat less effective. So these are sort of like fancier drugs. They're somewhat less effective in terms of improving overall health, and they're somewhat more costly. I mean, if they're drugs, the marginal cost of producing it isn't very significant, but they may still be under patent and so forth. So in terms of like the expenditures that say Medicare or the health insurers is doing, they could be substantially higher than the category 1. But it's still a case that you have pretty large benefits and relatively modest costs. And then these category 3 treatments are the ones that we've been discussing So things like angioplasty and stents, and then you can also have more invasive surgery, things like bypass surgery and so forth. And they do have benefits, at least sort of on average, or for certain sets of patients, not necessarily for all of the marginal patients who are getting it. But they do have benefits, but they also come at huge costs. So essentially, anytime you get into surgery, it becomes very expensive. So then if you kind of look and try to do sort of an accounting of what the different sources of increased cardiovascular health from, say, 1980 to 2000 are, it turns out that, first of all, the majority of it is not necessarily just from improved healthcare. So that makes up a significant portion, but it's not the majority. And second of all, when you look into sort of, you break healthcare into those different categories, it turns out that the most expensive treatments are actually responsible for only a minority of the total improved health, at least as best as we can estimate. So, this table should be interpreted with the caveat that in some cases these may you may actually have randomized controlled trials that are basically estimating what the effects of each of these treatments are on the outcomes. But in a lot of cases, they're using like observational data to try to estimate, so not experimental data, to try to estimate the effects of each of these interventions for each of these treatments, and whether or not that estimate is actually representative of causal effect could be debated. But so taking the estimates for what they are, what the authors in this article find is basically that about 60% of the decline, so there's there's a decline in mortality from cardiovascular disease from 1980 to 2000. They think that 60% of that decline could be basically chalked up to like improvements in reduced smoking rates, reduced hypertension, lower cholesterol levels, and higher levels of physical activity potentially. But then, so those are things that are sort of trending in an improving direction. But there are some other factors that are trending in like a negative or a harmful direction. So body mass index, as we know, is increasing over time for the US and actually for most other countries, and then the rate of diabetes is going up. So basically, it's like these sort of lifestyle things. From the first category, would expect like 60% of decline to accrue from that. But then from the second category, things that are actually getting worse, then there's like a 17% increase through that. So those two numbers net out to be like 44% of the total decline in cardiovascular disease mortality is coming from these sort of health risk or risky behaviors factors. Then they look at essentially improvements that come from healthcare. So there's these three different categories. So the very cheap, very cost-effective treatments are being used more often, and so 22% of the decline comes from that. Then there's these reasonably cost-effective category 2 treatments, and they think that 13% of the decline comes from that. And then there's this like relatively expensive category 3 treatments that mainly involve surgery, and only about 12% of the total decline is occurring from those things. So they are helping, but at a very high cost.
What percent of like the type 3 things being like relative to the other ones? How often are they being used? Because if they're doing like 12%, they're using like only 5% as much as the other two. Then it makes sense to be more expensive because it has so few people doing it. The jacks the prices up. Right?
Well, sorry, what do you mean by if so few people are doing it, then your total spending is less, right?
Well, I'm saying like if it costs like 100 times as much as aspirin, and it's being used 5%
Right.
as much, then it's being used by so many people. But I mean, like, isn't part of the reason the price is so high is just fewer people could be using that type, which makes the price, like,
So like there could be economies of scale or something like that? Or?
Exactly. So like because aspirin is being taken by millions and millions of people, that's what makes it more cost effective. And people, only very few people that actually need it to buy that.
So I think if like if category 3 things here involve a lot of drugs, then I think what you're saying would be correct in the sense that in terms of like the total cost of producing a drug, it's all in the fixed costs of development, and then the marginal cost of like making another aspirin or whatever is very close to zero. So in that case, as you increase the number of number of like prescriptions that you're providing, the unit cost should fall. I mean, when it's non-patent, there's some issue there, but. Right. So okay. So in this case, so these are not drug treatments. These are mainly surgery treatments. So for surgery, I don't think there's going to be any economies of scale at all because it's not, it's actually a human being who's sitting there and cutting most of the time. So you don't really sort of, there's no like assembly line or anything like that has some sort of economy of scale to it. As for MRIs, so it's true that like if you have an MRI machine, then ideally you would like to sort of get a maximum utilization out of that machine and have it in operation as much as possible in terms of like amortizing the costs over a certain number of MRIs. But I think sort of overall, I mean, there's so many MRI machines in the United States that I don't think that on aggregate. So like from an individual provider's perspective, the MRI machine is a fixed cost, and they would like to sort of get as many MRIs out as possible. But I think from like the entire United States perspective, you could think of MRIs as being like marginal cost. Like we could buy one more MRI machine and get however many hundred more MRIs out of it or something. But you wouldn't really sort of be concerned about like is that last MRI machine getting like 90% utilization or 80% utilization.
So I guess along the lines of what he's asking, I don't know if so like if you use the MRI to the fullest capacity, would that possibly lower the rates for MRI? Yes. I guess that's what he's.
Yeah. So that's a good question. I mean, it's going to come down to. So at that point, it's going to come down to like the reimbursement rate that the insurer negotiates with the hospital or with the doctors group. And I guess to the extent that they're using it more intensively, they might be able, like the the doctors are never going to purchase the machine if they don't think they can get their return back, right? And so if they're using it more extensively, the insurer may be able to negotiate like a lower rate potentially. But also I think a lot of that is actually based on like a lot of the rates for the insurers. They sort of take as a starting point like the rate that Medicare pays, and so then it's really like however Medicare decides to set the reimbursement rates for the machine. So I would say eventually through all the negotiations there could be some effect, but there wouldn't be like a direct effect in the sense that directly speaking, the doctors are just going to get paid a set dollar amount per MRI that they do, and doing more MRIs or less MRIs isn't going to affect their own reimbursement rate per MRI necessarily. I do think sometimes I sort of wonder why they're not like running them 24 hours a day, especially with MRIs, because I've never gotten a CT scan, nor do I wish to anytime in the near future. But I mean, so if you got an X-ray, that's like almost instantaneous. They just put you on the table and they X-ray you and you're done. It's like there's some like prep time, but your actual time